Many of this year's entries featured impressive in-depth investigations. Here now are winners. The U.S. electricity grid is abstract and complex, but relentless reporting turned a story full of technical detail into what the judges called powerful journalism that broke news and led to change. The winning entry in investigative journalism is Who Killed the Supergrid by Peter Fairley for InvestigateWest and The Atlantic magazine.
When I became aware that there was important research at the national labs that was being bottled up by the Trump administration, by political considerations, it was just, enraging that this important research that taxpayers had funded was being squelched.
Bringing this kind of thing to light is, it's incredibly difficult as a journalist to write about this kind of thing and to find the kind of language to tell this kind of story and make people care about it.
This is another great example of holding power to account, of journalists who are digging into the weeds in these things and uncovering details, because there's a lot of self-interest with a lot of big corporations, industries, lobby groups, power groups.
The SEAMS study by DOE's National Renewable Energy Lab set out to determine whether uniting America's big grids would pay. And the study's results bore that hypothesis out. But Trump appointee Katie Jareza's email put the study in trouble. And the $1.6 million study itself disappeared.
One of the biggest opportunities for addressing climate change is to decarbonize the power system. So it's something that has to happen. And one of the many stories where somebody or a group of people in the Trump administration welched the science, rejected something that would pay for itself, that would be in the national security, in the financial, in the environmental interests of the country.
We immediately had impact through the House Science Committee. The Secretary of Energy wrote letters demanding answers. There was an amendment to a bill that demanded that the study be released. Once people saw that story run, they saw that change was possible.
The next winning entry investigates how the oil industry shaped modern marketing and propaganda to subvert science. The Madmen by Amy Westervelt for the podcast Drilled lays out 100 years of manipulation, misinformation, and public perception, and wins in the audio-radio category.
What Amy did was go back and find out the role of big oil over 100 years, how it has tried to manipulate the public.
So fossil fuel industry organizations fund these fake front groups, and they give these fake front groups these names that they're like perfectly innocuous names, like the California Drivers Alliance. So it's fake activism. It's corporate money posing as activism, and it's designed to undo all of the progress that real activism makes.
When I first started Drilled, I tried to pitch it to a bunch of different podcast companies, and they all told me that there was no audience for a climate podcast. And so I made it on my own because I was convinced that there was, and the more I started looking into it, the more I realized that PR techniques for oil and tobacco really evolved alongside each other all along the way from, the late 1800s to now.
She links all the way through the way that big oil has hired people to lie. It's as simple as that.
What is so powerful about this series is that it kind of ties all this history together to our present moment. It goes beyond our easy understanding of, yes, the oil industry, big oil has sort of subverted science, and really gone back and showed how big oil invented fake news and invented the whole idea of public relations campaigns and of spin.
It's useful to see that these things are not new, like they've been around for a long time. And I think if we can get a better understanding of why these strategies came about and how and what the thinking was behind them, then we can diffuse them.
Our next entry looked in the mirror, reminding journalists of their own biases when covering the climate story. Winning in the commentary category, Michelle Garcia's probing essay for The Nation magazine, "The Media Isn't Ready to Cover Climate Apartheid."
Climate apartheid is a phrase that comes out of the United Nations report that looks at the truism that climate change in general hits the poor and people of color around this world first and worst.
Once I started thinking about a climate apartheid framework, I began looking at stories through an entirely different lens. I began thinking about how are we going to confront a global worldwide crisis through a lens that is not based on, as I wrote in my piece, the worldview of a relatively wealthy white middle class, upper middle class.
Neglecting certain groups of people signals that they are unimportant, an erasure that media scholars call symbolic annihilation. This became especially obvious with the pandemic, when seemingly overnight, the least paid and most exploited workers were rebranded essential workers.
It was brilliant that she connected it to the way that the media had covered COVID and how much people just missed why communities of color were being impacted hardest by this virus.
The COVID story has hit on the same themes as what we're going to be seeing with the climate emergency. The rich and poor gap has been there for both stories. I think COVID has been very helpful in helping people frame how to think about the climate story.
If we're not able to identify the structural inequalities, inequities in this pandemic, this was a wake-up call for what is to come and what is happening already with the climate crisis.
This entry takes us to Brazil, where the Amazon rainforest hangs in the balance and humanity's climate future along with it. Jake Spring's aggressive, fast-paced reporting exposed the Brazilian government's loosening of deforestation regulations. Spring's work for the Reuters news agency is the winner in the breaking news category.
President Bolsonaro is a bit of a climate pariah, as we know, and doesn't recognize the urgency and the importance of it. And the articles uncovered that the Brazilian authorities, under the guise of the COVID-19 pandemic, was reversing and rolling back some of these environmental protection measures for the rainforest, and the incredible danger and effect that this was potentially going to have.
What the series did also is show the implications for the rest of the world, the loss of biodiversity, the loss of carbon sink, the extra emissions, the damage done by this just huge scale of deforestation, will echo in the climate signature for decades. It happened really quickly too. There was a huge increase in deforestation in a very short time. And so it was crucial to investigate what was happening and to report it very quickly and to stay on it.
You had a governmental source admit to the rollback of certain environmental protection measures. It had ramifications within Brazil itself and internationally as well.
You actually are the winner of the Covering Climate Awards.
Wow.
This year.
Wow.
Congratulations.
I can't believe it, honestly. Wow, that's crazy. It's just a huge honor to hear that, that body of work is being recognized. So the number one thing that the Bolsonaro government has done is they have weakened environmental enforcement. For my reporting in 2020, it was just kind of another tightening of the screws. The pandemic, they used that to roll back environmental enforcement by another third. One thing I had recognized is that the current Bolsonaro government did not respond at all to criticisms from foreign governments, from NGOs at all. The one thing I noticed that they did listen to were businesses and investors. I found many that were willing to go on record saying they would divest from Brazil if things continue to worsen. And that really, within a couple of weeks, the government called in these very same investors to meet with them to try to reassure them that they were taking action.
It is extraordinarily encouraging to see how many courageous, fearless, independent-minded journalists have decided the climate story is theirs. That is how change has come about, to expose villains, to expose money flow, to expose corporate malfeasance, and it is media malpractice not to hold a powerful account.